Welcome to Kedem channel, and today we are speaking about unexpectedly controversial topic, which is actually the document which we have from Kiev and Rus. And this document is written in Hebrew, in fact, not in Russian, not in any other language, in Hebrew. And I am, of course, with Dr. Benjamin Outhwaite, is the head of the Cairo Genizah research unit at Cambridge University. And please explain us about this document.
It's one of the unusual manuscripts from a obscure part of the world that ends up in Cairo. What is quite amazing about the Cairo Genizah is the way in which it soaked up manuscripts from across the whole Jewish world. So we do have documents, from as far west as Spain, and as far east as even sort of Malaysia. We have mentions of Java recently discovered and things like that. And then from the north, Mainz, or from the northeast of Persia and sort of Afghanistan. So to people who know the Genizah, it's not that surprising. But in the early days of Genizah research, when this was first discovered and published by Norman Golb, great scholar, grand old man of sort of some of the earliest work on the documentary Genizah, particularly of documents that related to the history of Jews in Europe. When he first published it, it was very much a surprise, and he actually wrote this book with Omelian Pritsak, so Norman Golb and Omelian Pritsak, Khazarian Hebrew documents of the 10th century, which focuses on a number of documents that talk about the Khazars in Jewish tradition, and which come from the Cairo Genizah. So he looked at this letter, which is a small piece of parchment, a rectangle about that big, written in Hebrew, which introduces a Jewish man who has fallen into debt. It's actual fact, it's his brother, if I remember right, it's his brother who took on a large loan for business purposes, died, and the loan has now fallen onto his brother to repay. And he's been imprisoned because he's had an iron collar put on him because it's a substantial amount of money, he can't pay it. And to solve the problem, the Jewish community have done what appears to be quite common in the Middle Ages, which is to write a letter of introduction explaining the unfortunate situation and asking for charity, and then sending that person off with this letter to a richer Jewish community to raise the money. Now, we have letters like this from Spain. We know that they sent similar letters from Spain asking for charity for particular pathetic cases of people who had really fallen on hard times, because Egypt was regarded as, and rightly, as one of the richest Jewish centres, because it was the centre of this world trade that was happening during the Fatimid period, when it was really the centre of the sort of civilised Islamic world. And so this document ends up in the Cairo Genizah, presumably because it was carried by the man or a representative of this debtor, who was trying to raise substantial amounts of gold to pay off a loan and have his freedom restored to him. Now, what's interesting about the letter is it's written in Hebrew, which is not unexpected when international correspondence between Jews from two different worlds is generally done in Hebrew, because that's the language they have in common. But there's also a feeling that even when they both speak Arabic, for instance, they would prefer to use Hebrew when it's a matter of charity, partly because that document might well be presented in a synagogue. So if the man ends up in Egypt, he might be pushed out in front of the audience of the synagogue, one evening, and encouraged to read his letter, and then they will pass the hat around and raise money. And we know they did this because we have documents in the Genizah that record the amounts of money given for charitable purposes in the Genizah. And so if he reads that out in a synagogue, it is only appropriate to read it in Hebrew, because in this period, so if the letter was written in the 10th or 11th century, Hebrew and Aramaic were the only acceptable languages in the synagogue in Egypt. It's written in Hebrew, it's written in a very nice Hebrew hand by someone who is probably a professional scribe, and it's signed by all the members of the community. But the whole thing is in Hebrew. What's unusual about it, and the Hebrew is unremarkable, it's the normal Hebrew of this period. It uses the usual expressions for charity in it, but it says, "We, the community of Kiev," so Kiev, They say, we are asking you to look after this man, you to blah, blah, blah. What's interesting is the members of probably the Bet Din who signed it, some of them have names that are not Hebrew names. So there's a Yehuda there, there's a Chanukah, and there are some Cohens there, but there's also people with odd names like Manar and Kofin, which are not Semitic names. And the question is, and in Hebrew, they're written in Hebrew, but they're very unusual names. And the question is, well, who are these people? And Golb's explanation is that these are Khazars who have converted to Judaism, and it is that the Jewish community of Kiev is a Khazarian Jewish community. And while we know about the Khazars, there are legends from Judah Halevi's great Sefer HaKuzari is based on the very popular stories that the Khazarian tribes converted en masse to Judaism at the order of their king.
Yeah, that was kind of legend in the Middle Ages.
Yes, and that we have chronicles again from the Genizah that talk about the story. The king of the Khazars was invited. It sounds like the beginning of a joke. A rabbi, an imam and a priest, and said, tell me, about your religion. And he listened to them, and then he decided that, he would go with Judaism. Now, this story is regarded as legendary in that aspect, but the essential fact that the Khazars converted to Judaism is kind of accepted. And there is a good reason to think it's true. I mean, there is some evidence, but there's a good reason to understand why they would do that. And it's not so much that they liked Judaism better than in Islam and Christianity, but because the Khazars were sandwiched between the Byzantines on one side, great Christian nation, and the Muslims on the other side. And which side do you choose? Oh well, maybe if you want to stay neutral, Judaism is a good choice. And so what Golb argues is that this document comes from one of these Khazar communities who have fully adopted Judaism to the point that they can read and write Hebrew extremely well, and some of them have adopted Jewish names, but many of them have, non-Semitic Turkic names. Further evidence is provided by the fact that at the bottom of the document there is a line of what look like runes, which Pritzak, who is the specialist in this, argues are Khazarian runes, that a Khazarian official, perhaps a non-Jewish official, has looked at the letter, maybe when it left Kiev or whatever, went, across the border, somebody had to, ascertain what it is, and could this man carry it? And it says, supposedly in Khazarian, I have read it. Meaning, I've looked at it, it's
kind
fine.
of approved.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
approved to be sent.
Exactly. It's a sort of, it's a stamp of approval. Now, when Golb published that, and he wrote, as I say, a whole book on it, and argued that this is the earliest evidence for the Jewish community in Kiev, and that it has Khazarian roots. Many people were convinced, but Golb himself is a controversial figure, was well known for taking extreme stands on questions, or going entirely with his own opinions and disregarding others. And so there's been quite a lot of pushback over the years, over the decades since he published that, as to whether you can even read the word Kiev in the letter, because unfortunately, like most Genizah documents, it's damaged. And although the whole letter is more or less intact, it's stained with water. It's on parchment, the parchment is discoloured. And unfortunately, the word Kiev is under a watermark, there's a stain on it, and you can't read the kuf.
So it's not so clear, yeah?
No, it says Kahal Shel Yuv. It's clearly a place name because they've written Yud Yud Vav Bet. They've written a Rafeh over the Bet, indicating that it's an unusual word, so they're showing you how to pronounce it, and they've written a Cholem on the Vav. So it's a word that, they wouldn't expect somebody to know, so they've put Nikud on it. There aren't many places that it could be. The document itself clearly comes from the Byzantine world because it's written on parchment at a time when they could have written on paper, perhaps, if they come from Egypt. It's folded and scored in a peculiar way that we find in Byzantine documents, not in Egyptian ones. And the non-Semitic names in it and the runes on it all suggest that Golb is right. If he's right, then it is the earliest and, in fact, only documentary evidence of a Jewish community in the 10th century in Kiev.
And maybe it tells us also on the Kiev itself, on the identity of people who live there. I mean, the ruler of Kiev is mentioned as the great Kagan, great Kakanus in this document. The European documents of the, if I am not mistaken, Karl the Great is mentioning his embassy sent to Europe, and he is saying the, I mean, it's also kind of the Khazarian, probably Khazarian name of the ruler, you know, the great Kakanus, great Kogan.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of very interesting, evidence that can be taken, that there is a strong Jewish current in that society. The letter itself, I mean, what I think is interesting about it is it's a very polished, finely produced letter. The Hebrew is extremely good. It's a beautiful piece of parchment that's been carefully preserved. It has been signed by all the members of the community. It suggests that it's not the product of a small, band of people, that it's of a working society that's produced this, so a Jewish society. So we're not talking about an isolated, few Jews who've maybe formed a trading outpost, up the river, and they've settled there. It suggests, which was one way that you might get migration up these great trading routes. But it does suggest a fully formed Jewish community that has, a minyan who can come together to sign a document, and that it goes through the various procedures. And it's also got the writing of a parnas on it, and a parnas is a charitable official, so it suggests, there is a working community has done this. So it's the nature of the Cairo Genizah that we just have this single document, from this community that we know of. And you look at it, you think, well, why don't we have any more from them? Why don't we have their ketubot or the gitin or trading documents or whatever? But on the other hand, we're a bit spoilt in the Genizah. We should be thankful that we have even this one piece of evidence, right? Because there's absolutely no reason we should have a letter, from Kiev.
In general, we do not have any documents from Kiev preserved.
Yeah.
All mentions of this Kiev and the history of Kiev and Rus is all from much later documents of, maybe 12th, 13th century, which have Russian origin, but they are not describing the reality which they see. They describe some history, and of course, we never know what they invented, what they knew about the history. And this document is authentic document, which belongs to the
this written at that time, an original document that came from that city. If it says Kiev, if it says Kiev, Kahal shel Kiev. Now that, because that's the crucial question, has been looked at again and again over the decades. So Gold read it as Kiev and makes good arguments as to why he can see that. People have come back with microscopes in the early days of ultraviolet imaging. They looked at it under ultraviolet light. More recently, we now do multispectral imaging, where we take like 50 different images under every spectrum of visible and invisible light, and then you use computer technology to isolate, one part of the ink and reduce the others, and we still can't read through the water stain. However, I think that if you actually hold the manuscript up slightly sideways, I'm pretty sure I can see the leg of the kuf visible in the manuscript.
So, and your take on that, it's the key.
I think it's the only thing it can be. I mean, years ago, people said to me, no, it's Kalyub. Now, Kalyub is a place in Egypt. It could be, but somebody writing from Kalyub wouldn't necessarily have written in Hebrew. They wouldn't have used parchment. They wouldn't have scored it in a business, and they would have had Egyptian or Arabic names. They wouldn't have been called Mana and, all these odd names. You would have had Abul Faraj would have signed it for sure. There's an Abul Faraj in every community. So that's not credible. You have to one, look at the evidence of the writing, but you also have to look at the physical evidence. And the physical evidence is it doesn't look like something from our world, from our Islamic world of the Genizah. It looks foreign. It looks European. It looks Ashkenazi. It looks everything that we don't find in the Cairo Genizah normally. And Kiev is the best explanation for what that word is, Kiev, because it's a short word that ends Eov and probably has a kuf. Okay,
and if we see that this document was approved by some probably Khazarian authority, I don't know, postal authority, or whatsoever. What does it mean? They ruled over the area? It was just passing the area? They ruled over the Kiev?
Yeah, presumably it means that either that the man who left, I mean, there are questions, because the man owed money, and he had a collar on at some point, a sort of substantial iron collar and chains, And so presumably, in order to collect the money, he had to be officially kind of released from custody and sent off with the understanding that he would come back, right? And presumably they had some way to guarantee that he would come back. I don't know, hostages or whatever. The rest of the community would suffer if he didn't come back. But presumably, therefore, somebody had to sign off on him being released from prison because he was in a debtor's prison and sent off, with his freedom to raise money from his rich Jewish friends or rich Jewish compatriots.
Yeah, but
in
he is
Egypt.
released probably by Khazarian Authority if they wrote in the
Yeah, presumably that's the only explanation for that. It's not, it's not a Jewish authority writing Khazarian runes on it because why? I mean, every other element of the document is written in Hebrew. If there was a Jewish authority signing it.
So also can give us a hint who is ruling over the Kiev, I don't know.
Yeah.
At that time, or Kiev
Of course,
and Rus.
it does rely on you reading those as Khazarian runes, and I think that some people have argued that you can't, it's not as obvious as Pritzak said it was, but, what do I know from Khazarian? I mean, I have to assume that he knows better than I do.
Yeah, so head of the Cairo Genizah research unit, Dr. Benjamin Outhwaite, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.